Well, here we are, the fourth Sunday of Ordinary Time of the church year, and things are really beginning to pick up speed. In the gospel passage of our last two Sunday celebrations, we heard about Jesus being identified by John the Baptist as the one he was expecting, the Son of God. And then we saw Jesus call his first disciples, Peter and Andrew, and James and John. And now in today's gospel, Jesus begins his work. And how does he begin his work? By casting out a demon? By curing a leper? By raising someone from the dead? No, he begins by preaching his first sermon, called, as we heard it today in Matthew's version, his Sermon on the Mount. Jesus begins his ministry by preaching, by teaching. And this is such an appropriate way for him to begin, since his vocation was to be a rabbi, a teacher. But we can see that right from the start, Jesus will not be a conventional rabbi, selecting only the brightest and the best, the most promising of candidates for his pupils. Hardly. Just look at them. A few fishermen, a tax collector who worked for the Romans, a zealot who spent his life trying to overthrow the Romans, a ragtag bunch of losers to whom most rabbis wouldn't give the time of day. This is how the church began. And this is how the church continues. We heard this in our second reading today, St. Paul writing to the Corinthians. Consider your own calling, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many of noble birth. Rather, God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise. And God chose what is weak of the world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised of the world that count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human being might boast before God. But St. Paul is also writing to us. So remember in a couple of minutes what he said when we start thinking about our own calling. So what exactly does Jesus say in this first sermon of his? Jesus begins by teaching with what we have come to be known as the Beatitudes. 8 statements of what it means to be blessed by God. And here again, Jesus shows us that he will not be a conventional rabbi. For Jesus explains how God will bless those whom God loves, and the sign of this blessedness is nothing like we would expect. In this world, we would presume that those who are blessed are the ones who are safe and secure, healthy, productive, free from pain, free from fear, free from want. When we count our blessings, aren't those the criterias we would generally use? Wouldn't they be the external signs of God's favor on us? Yet Jesus says just the opposite. He says we are blessed when we are poor, when we mourn, when we are persecuted. Why? Because it is precisely in those times of weakness, of struggle, of difficulty, in those times that God is closest to us. And by extension, because those are the times that combine our greatest need with our greatest weakness, those are the times when we can be most open to God's presence. It is at those times when we no longer are self-reliant that we can be most open to the presence and power of God, who is always with us. But there is something beyond a formula for our blessedness in Jesus' Beatitudes, and that is that Jesus is outlining in these brief statements what his ministry and his life will be like. They are a blueprint for how Jesus will teach, will heal, and will suffer in the 3 years of his upcoming public life. From the time he rejects Satan's temptation in the desert, he will be poor in spirit, turning away from the comforts and pleasures of this world. In all of his miracles, he will show God's mercy to those who suffer in so many ways. He will mourn and weep over his friend Lazarus, as well as over the holy city of Jerusalem. And he will suffer insult and persecution and every kind of unimaginable evil for the sake of the kingdom. Yes, the Beatitudes are not just platitudes. They are the pattern and the direction of everything Jesus will live. Everything Jesus says in the Beatitudes, he will do. Just as Jesus called his first disciples, Jesus calls us. And, well, we might feel, I'm not really qualified. There are many others who could do much more and be much more effective in preaching the gospel. And remember who Jesus chose first: fisherman, a tax collector, a zealot. And remember what we heard St. Paul tell the Corinthians, that God chooses those who are not wise or powerful, but rather the weak and the lowly. In other words, us. Jesus calls us to teach, to preach, and to proclaim the good news. Now, most of us will not spend our lives in a classroom or a lecture hall, but we should remember what St. Francis of Assisi told his disciples: preach always, and when necessary, use words. And we can change preach to teach. Teach always, and when necessary, use words. We hear a lot of discussion these days about what they call the core curriculum. Well, the core curriculum that Jesus calls us to proclaim is not to be found in a syllabus or a book, but rather in our heart, the core of who we are. Each one of us lives our life in a unique intersection of relationships and responsibilities, of opportunities and interactions. Each one of us is the only gospel that some people will hear or encounter. No pope, no bishop, no priest, sister, or theologian will come in contact with them. We are the one who is being sent to bring them the good news. Again, we hear St. Paul this time speaking to the Romans and saying to them and us, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one in whom they have not believed? And how can they believe in the one in whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone to preach? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Teaching is at the heart of the church, of who we are as church. Teaching is the vocation that each one of us received at our baptism. But before we conclude our reflection, just a brief word about what we're celebrating this week, as I mentioned earlier, and that's Catholic Schools Week. And I'll say a little bit more about this in the announcements after Mass. But for now, I just want to acknowledge how blessed we are to have our wonderful parish here at St. Joseph's, which has been here educating children here in the faith for 173 years. Yeah, that's right, 173 years. What a blessing it has been for literally thousands of children and their families. But that is just one ministry of the parish that proclaims the gospel in the world today in so many ways. As St. Paul said to each one of us, that we are sent to do the same. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Did you know your feet are beautiful?